welcome to another web meetup of Ayn Rand Center UK. My name is Nikos Sotirakopoulos and I'm the academic advisor of the center. And tonight we have a very important event with two important scientists. So we have a discussion called Evolution and Volition in Psychology. And we will discuss issues around the dichotomy, whether there is such a thing, between determinism and free will. And just to make it clear, I'm not a psychologist, so I might use these terms very loosely. So don't quote me on this. That's why we have the experts. And our experts on the topic is Dr. Gena Gorlin and Dr. Diana Fleischman. So Gina is an assistant professor of clinical psychology in the Fairclough Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University in New York. And also she's a licensed psychology practicing in New York. And can I also encourage people to visit Gina's two blogs? So she has a personal blog where she's tweeting some very interesting things and some things that actually gave me quite encouraging stuff, specifically at the beginning of the pandemic, on ways to cope psychologically with all this uncertainty and all this situation, but also hear more kind of, let's say, technical, scientific, academic writings in Psychology Today blog. Again, I might have butchered the terminology here, but bear with me. And also we have Diana Fleischman with us today. So Dr. Fleischman is an evolutionary psychologist and a senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. And she's also having some very interesting articles in her blog. So if you Google the name, you'll find the blog, or actually the blog is dianafleischman.com. That's her website, and you can see her blog there. So we have two people who really understand their field and who will give us an understanding of this, as I said, debate, or this dichotomy. We didn't want to use the term debate, between determinism and free will. And this is something that comes up in various areas. For example, on issues around gender differences and if there is such a thing, or things such as inherent traits. So a lot of the things that are, let's say, in the epicenter of the culture wars nowadays have to do and go at the root of these questions. So are there, let's say, group characteristics, or is every individual still has the ability to make his or her own choices? Enough for me. Without further ado, let's begin, and let's start with Gina.
Hi, thank you for that very flattering introduction. I guess I'll just speak to my general background and regarding the topic broadly to start. So as you mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I approach these topics from a very clinical perspective as someone interested primarily in helping people change, helping people become the best, happiest, most fulfilled versions of themselves. And so, as you might imagine, I have a real investment in understanding and promoting self-change in all the different forms that our interventions are able to encourage that and to guide it. So my take on the questions of free will and determinism, which I've written a little bit about academically, but also, kind of more clinically, there's a lot I could say, and I'm sure it'll, a lot will come out of the Q&A and discussion. But briefly, I think that I have a somewhat heterodox view relative to the academy that we have the power, we have the agency to change ourselves, to make all kinds of choices that then meaningfully impact how our life goes and how our character traits and our predispositions actually play out for us. We have the power to reshape ourselves in meaningful ways. And that a more specific aspect of my view is that the locus of that agency is actually cognitive or metacognitive, in the sense that to the extent that we choose to kind of turn our minds toward rather than away from various kinds of data, internal and external, we gain control or we lose control, depending on what we choose to the extent that we kind of choose to turn toward versus to turn away and to self-deceive and to rationalize and kind of selectively distort aspects of our experience, that by being our own kind of most informed agents, to the extent that we're actively kind of taking responsibility for figuring out ourselves and figuring out the world, we gain power to act on that knowledge and make significant changes. So I'll leave it at that for now. Hopefully that raises enough questions, for us to discuss.
Thank you. Diana, starting thoughts.
Okay. My name is Diana Fleischman. I'm an evolutionary psychologist. Right now I live in New Mexico, and I have a very determinist view, a fairly hard determinist view on the question of free will. So when you talk about free will and determinism, you often come up against very confusing definitions. So Dan Dennett, who's one of the most famous, what's called compatibilists, that is somebody who believes that free will and determinism are in some way compatible, has redefined what determinism and free will essentially mean. And Dan Dennett says something to the effect that free will is the ability to choose between various different options. That's the variety of free will versus wanting. And he doesn't really dispute the fact that everything that we do comes from prior causes. And so the difficult thing about the free will versus determinism kind of debate is that even though determinism is more what you would call parsimonious, or it's in keeping with other things that we know about the physical universe, we feel internally as if we have free will and that we are making choices and that we could have chosen otherwise. And in Gina's paper that she has in the description here, she talks about a variety of things that are difficult about free will. When people don't believe in free will, they tend to have more problems. And so she's got a vested interest in people believing in free will, because free will helps us to navigate the world with a more internal locus of control, you could call it that, which is that we are, manage our destiny, or manage our fate. And what often happens, as you could see in the link that I put in, is that people confuse determinism with something called fatalism. And fatalism is the idea that things are fated and that things, you really have no choice. I'm saying that people do feel that they have choices, but that feeling of choice is actually a culmination of prior causes. Just because you feel that there are two possible things that you could be doing at any moment, that's what you would feel in any kind of an adaptive system where the choices that you make have adaptive sorts of repercussions. So just because you feel that, what I'm saying is that it's just not parsimonious. And so what I think people who are arguing for free will are doing is they are prioritizing their internal feelings over all of the other standards of evidence that there are in the world.
Okay.
Do I get to respond now, or how does this work?
Yes, let's have a round of responses, and then I have some questions for both of you.
Yeah, sounds good. So thank you, Diana, for articulating very clearly both some of the different terminology that's used, and I agree with you that there's a lot of confusion around these different terms, and kind of where you stand relative to the determinism free will debate. So I think if I were to zero in on the one fundamental disagreement that will probably then help to explain whatever other differences we might have and kind of need to hash out, it would be with the premise that the more evidence-based and the more parsimonious view is one in which we live in a deterministic universe. I actually, don't think there's any real evidence to conclude or to make that inference. I think the kinds of arguments from which we make that inference involve a kind of speculation on the basis of the physical universe, and the particular ways that we observe, although not consistently anymore, what with, quantum phenomena that I don't understand, kind of ways that we observe causality operating in the physical universe or physical matter, that we make an unwarranted inference to the extent that we assume that every aspect of the world, including our own consciousness, is going to operate in what Rand, for example, I think referred to as like pinball style causality, like one thing causes the next thing, causes the next thing, dominoes falling. And I think actually the onus of proof is on, anyone who asserts a generalization about kind of how causality operates, how we would kind of articulate the causal structure of a given phenomenon, especially to the extent that we don't understand much about it or that we're still really getting to know it. And in the case of consciousness, I think where we gain some of our evidence and some of our first observations is largely introspective and, through observation, through kind of connection to other people, but fundamentally, we develop a theory of mind primarily and initially through our own self-awareness and our own observations of ourselves. And we have far more direct data to the effect of kind of noticing ourselves making certain kinds of metacognitive choices and noticing ourselves shifting our attention back and forth, noticing ourselves kind of looking toward or away from, certain aspects of our experience that occur to us, or even just, deciding between two items on a menu. And that data is far more directly accessible to us than the kind of data we would need to make really universal inferences about all the kinds of phenomena that might exist in the universe and how they, and what we can assume about their causal structure, if you will. So, probably lots more that needs clarifying there, but I don't actually think that the illusion, that the deception is at the level of, well, I pretend to have free will, but really I don't. I think there's a lot more self-deception that I've observed in the realm of trying to kind of either avoid that responsibility or trying to kind of rationalize away the ways in which, we carry the responsibility for our own choices, trying to externalize some of that responsibility, which, in a clinical context can be really scary. It can be uncomfortable. It can be, a big burden on our shoulders, depending on kind of how efficacious we feel ourselves to be. So, so I think, the burden of proof would actually have to be on anyone asserting the deterministic inference.
Okay.
Right. Diana.
So I'm just going to try to pick apart what you think here. So you do think that so B.F. Skinner talks about how for a long time in physics, physics was actually impaired because the idea was that objects had volition. So objects could become more impetuous as they move forward. And then that's why there was objects accelerating in space, is because of the impetuosity that is like the personality, or you could even say like the conscious state of the objects. And he talks about how when we moved away from considering objects as having a conscious will, we were better able to predict their behavior. Now, with humans, we get a lot of self-report from people. And I think that you would probably agree with me that the self-report of people is often not as predictive in determining what they're going to do as other things that we would know about their behavior and their genetics, for example. But as an evolutionary psychologist, we often think about things from a kind of comparative perspective. So I remember a long time ago, I read a book called The Emperor of Scent, which was about this guy who came up with this new theory about smell. And he had this idea that, we can detect the vibration of electrons in molecules, and that's how we smell things. But, one of the big holes I saw, even when I was pretty young when I read that, was that he didn't actually talk about a comparative perspective. And in your paper, you talk about people being volitionally impaired. So where does free will start? So are there people without free will? Do animals have free will? Does C. elegans, the model organism, have free will? Like, do you think that it's possible to perfectly predict the behavior of some organisms in a deterministic way, but that this emergent property that you would call free will occurs at some level taxonomically?
Oh, great question. So I want to say a couple different things in response to a couple of points. I'm trying to think how to kind of order them. So I'll answer your last question first, because I think it's the big picture question under which some of the other points will fit. But in terms of where do I think it emerges and the boundary conditions for free will. So given my view, locus of free will as being metacognitive and as being dependent upon some degree of self-awareness and self-reflective capacity, I think it emerges with our ability, and I would need a developmental psychologist to help me place like where exactly, in the range of like passing the false belief task and, being able to talk about one's own feelings and call other people out on lying, or being able to tell one's own lies, kind of where in development this arises. But to the degree that we are able, and both within person and between person, kind of as and when we have an awareness of some alternative that's open to us between, for example, telling the truth or not, or between kind of thinking a little bit more or just jumping to a conclusion, and lots of other alternatives kind of that are more downstream. But to the extent that we're able to reflect on ourselves, on our own thinking, on our own choices, I think that's what gives rise to this agential mechanism through which, we're able to choose amongst motivations and notice our own motivations. I think I remember in a really fun discussion that I listened that you had with on the trigonometry show. It was an awesome, just entertainment value for one, and really informative. But there was a point when I think you spoke about just being self-aware of some of your motivations as a woman in relationships. And that struck me actually as a really nice example that insofar as you have some self-awareness about it, you probably are able to make more choices about the extent to which you act upon those motivations, the extent to which you override them in the moment, and you're able to bring other goals and other priorities to bear, and you're able to project longer term consequences of, whether or not in a given moment you kind of assert yourself and speak out, or, or you run a test to see if the guy is going to, cheat on you, or whether you kind of give him a little bit more time to warm up before, whatever the case may be. So I think that's just an example of that mechanism at work. And that relates to your question about, for example, the predictive validity of self-report measures versus behavioral, genetic, biological predictors, et cetera. And I would say it actually varies widely the extent to which we see better predictive validity for someone's, self-reported attitudes, say, toward a given racial category, or more clinically, their level of motivation for treatment, for example. And I would say probably more times than not, when you look at meta-analyses, when you look on the whole at the predictive validity of all these different indirect measures, including, a lot of genetic heritability based measures that we've tried to get variance, as much variance as possible from, that it's so much harder to get predictive validity with all those indirect measures of what we think should be predictive of behavior than it is with self-report. And I think, self-report often errs insofar as people don't always have great self-awareness, don't always have great insight, and might actually be, motivated to either self-deceive or to present outwardly, to manage the researcher's impressions, whatever the case may be. Lots of reasons why it often goes awry. But I think if we were to estimate the overall effect sizes for the predictive validity of self-report compared to the predictive validity of pretty much every other kind of measure we have, I think we would actually see that self-report has performed dramatically better on the whole with respect, if you ask somebody, so do you think you're going to order, the chocolate or the vanilla ice cream, and they tell you vanilla, versus if you do an IAT, I think overall you're going to get much better results with self-report.
Now, can I mention something here? I mean, the level of the discussion is very, very high. I'm going to bring it a bit to the layman's level. So Diana, can I ask you something? Again, excuse me if it's too simplistic, but it's so that people can properly understand what we mean by free will and what not. So let's say you have someone who throughout his life had one point of view, political point of view, and then let's say they come across some new ideas and they start thinking and they might start changing. And that's a slow process. And they read a bit more, they get a bit more convinced. They watch you, for example, on YouTube, they get some new idea, or then they face some important decision. So for example, oh, I met this girl at the bar, shall I cheat on my girlfriend? Or maybe should I betray my country for money? Or these very, very big things. So, and one would expect that when you take these decisions, your whole system, let's say, of values, of who you are, of what you believe in, comes into play. So would you say that in these processes, when it comes to big decisions about what's going to be your political orientation, what political party you're going to vote, what woman you're going to bring in your life, do you think that their people have what would simply say free will, which means, can they put the choices on the table and rationally say, I will choose option one because of this and this and this? Or do you think there's some mechanism that are in some way out of their direct control that have a big influence on this choice?
Okay, good question. And this actually does get me on into the response that I was going to make to Gina. So evolutionary psychologists and many other people have talked about the mind as not being a singular entity, as in the mind is actually partitioned into multiple parts. So we are consciously aware of some of our motivations and not. And when you, there's a very famous psychologist, the only psychologist to have won the Nobel Prize, called Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman had this idea called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is kind of your knee-jerk responses. It's, you know, let's say this was like the 1990s and you see two men kissing. And let's say you're disgusted by that. So you feel disgusted by two men kissing. And then you're in this part of your mind says, okay, that's disgusting. And then there's another part of your mind that's more slow and deliberative and more consciously connected that says, no, I don't want to be the kind of person who's prejudiced and bigoted. I want to earn the support of the people around me. So therefore, I want to have a different opinion. I'm going to discount this emotional response. So my view, and there's also a really good book called Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, by Robert Kurzban, which also talks about what he calls the press secretary module. So if I ask you why you did something, there's some very famous experiments about this where you have a split brain patient and they see one thing, their part of their brain that sees the thing is on one side, but the part of the brain that verbalizes it on the other side. So they just make up reasons why they did things. And people do this kind of all the time. So the part of you that is consciously aware reports things to other people about why they did things. Oh, I did that because I changed my mind because of X, Y, Z. But there can be much more mundane explanations. For example, one study found that the best predictor of somebody's views on drugs is actually their views about casual sex and how disgusted or judgmental they are about casual sex. They would say that they have a philosophical point of view about it, but actually it's better predicted by their views about sex, which is much more fundamental kind of evolutionarily. So my view is that if you think about the mind as being modular, a really easy way of looking at this is, for example, if you see a visual illusion, you see a visual illusion, you know that you're seeing a visual illusion, but you can't unsee it. Right? So the part of you that's consciously aware that you're seeing a visual illusion can't be uncoupled from the part of you that is actually seeing it and recognizing it. So my view is that when we feel like we have these choices, when we feel like we're just choosing between two things, it's similar to who's going to win in a fight. It's a guy who's bigger or a guy who's smaller, right? So it's similar to like thinking about these two aspects of your mind being in competition for one another. And what mostly people talk about is an impatient module. That is a module that's more in favor of quick benefits. So the module that wants to eat cake versus the part of your that wants to go for a run and get slimmer and become healthier, right? These are the kinds of things that are in competition. And so what Gina is endorsing in her therapeutic approach is trying to make your system 2 or your more deliberative consciousness stronger, so it can more often beat out the kind of impatient module. Now, if you're watching a fight between two guys and one of them is bigger and stronger than the other one, you wouldn't say it's free will as to who gets beat up and who doesn't get beat up, who wins the fight and who loses the fight. You would say it depends on who's bigger and who's weaker. And your volition, your will to increase the strength of your conscious deliberation and your cognitive will is actually a way of you trying to increase the size and strength of that aspect of your mind in relation to other aspects of your mind. So it feels like you're struggling. It feels like these two things are in competition and that your will wins out, but actually it's just metacognition. And I wouldn't think that somebody like Gina would say, okay, like let's say an artificial intelligence can look at its own code and detect an error and fix its own code. Does that have free will? That would be, by her definition, a sufficient criteria, because that has metacognition. That is metacognition as she defines it.
Follow up before we go to Gina. So what if the small guy is very well trained, like Jiu-Jitsu guy, and here's the training? What if the training is what I would philosophy? So for example, personally, when I change my philosophical views, I also change, for example, my views on what I enjoy in sex, on casual sex, on many things, on many very, very personal things. So couldn't you say that at least you could train a bit more the small guy so that he's more resistant to the urges? Or to, again, I use the term urges as a layman, to whatever is that thing that is pushing him towards a specific direction.
Yeah, so absolutely. I go on meditation retreat. I can't go this year, but I try to go once a year because of a variety of reasons. It breaks my addiction to social media. It helps the system too of mine become stronger. But I have chosen to go on meditation retreat. And why have I chosen to go on meditation retreat? I've chosen to go on retreat because of pre-existing causes. So I'll take you, you'll like this because you're Greek. You know the story of Odysseus, where he goes and he ties himself. So there's a famous story where Odysseus is on the ship and they know they're going to be passing by this island that has the sirens, and all the men jump in. So regardless of what you think about free will in this story, the men cannot stop from jumping in. And he wants to hear the sirens, but he also doesn't want these beautiful women singing, but he doesn't want to jump into his death. So all the men, they put wax in their ears, right? They all have a desire not to die, but they know that their desire not to die is not going to be able to overcome their desire to swim out to the sirens. But Odysseus, because of his characteristics, his adventure seeking, his sensation seeking, his high openness, which is another psychological construct, he decides to be tied to the mast, and he begs and begs and begs to be let go so he can drown at these women's feet. So it's very similar to that. When I decide to go on meditation retreat, I am tying myself to the mast. I am preventing myself from being lured away, my concentration being lured away. But that doesn't mean that my deciding to go on meditation retreat didn't have prior causes. It's actually the awareness that I have of my weakness of will that causes me to choose to do that. But it's a choice based on prior causes, based on my conscientiousness. And I think that when Gina talks about free will, she's talking about something that actually only can happen with people who have an IQ of a certain level. Anyway.
Okay, so we already have questions, but since I've asked the difficult question, okay, or in my mind, difficult question to Diana, I'll ask also a difficult question to Gina. So Gina, how do we explain?
Go ahead. I'll work it in. Yep.
So let's say us, the believers in free will. So we all recognize patterns of, not only patterns of behavior, but patterns of things that no matter what you tell yourself, it's difficult to fight. And an example is what people find attractive. So the traits of masculinity that most people find attractive, there are some specific characteristics, and many people have tried through what I call, I don't know, social engineering, or telling you that, oh no, this is, this is a toxic masculinity, whatever. But people react in specific ways to specific traits. And again, anyone having doubt on that, the success of 50 Shades or the success of 365 Days says something. I don't know what it says, but it says something interesting. So where does this leave us, supporters of free will? Are there some things that kind of hit straight in the head that it's difficult for us to, let's say, resist or explain or rationalize or overcome, or again, I'm using terms that I know you scientists are gonna be like, but I hope you get the point.
Yep. So yeah, so to address your question directly and then see if I can maybe work in some of my responses, to some of what Dana mentioned. So yes, absolutely. I think change is often really hard, you know, otherwise I wouldn't make the big bucks such as I do for help work their way through some of the long-standing, you know, habits, biases, tendencies, impulsivities, you know, weaknesses of will, though I have, you know, a somewhat different way of framing that they haven't been able to change on their own. And there's a lot of steps involved in first reaching that level of awareness of kind of what are some of the implicit, you know, assumptions or biases or associations that you formed, and how are they kind of driving your behavior, and can we put those into words where you can actually look at them and evaluate them in light of evidence, in light of what you actually know about the people that you have these, you know, gut reactions against, or whatever it may be. And then there's a lot of work to do that I've written a little bit about in some, you know, the blog posts you mentioned, a lot of work to internalize new knowledge through experience, through action, and some of the kinds of things that you were mentioning, Dana, where you go to meditation retreats and you kind of practice exerting control and overriding some of those, you know, impulsive tendencies that are short-sighted and that might otherwise kind of take you over before you know what hit you, right? There's tons of therapeutic techniques and whole schools of therapy that have been developed to help people with those kinds of tendencies that they want to gradually retrain in themselves and to learn how to overcome, and even to just get motivated to overcome, which itself can be a big process of kind of really weighing the pros and cons and understanding the evidence. So that's to answer your question, that yes, definitely it can be hard. And also we have tons of evidence from the clinical intervention literature to tell us that it's doable, you know, and that lots of people are able to do it. And I've seen it firsthand many times, and I've done it myself, and I've, you know, read the clinical trials, and above all, I've worked with many clients whom I've been honored to see the changes they've made over time, and things that used to be really hard that are now easy, that are now their new default. So, you know,
but to push you a bit more on that, I'm not only saying whether it's easy to change or not. I'm talking about some characteristics that maybe through evolution or whatever are in a way hardwired in our brain. And that's why I brought the example of, for example, what women find sexy in a man, for example. So the fact that throughout societies, or at least that's one very big theory, that throughout societies, throughout time, more or less these are the same traits. So could you say that these things are in some way hardwired to our brain?
Yeah, so you're gonna force me, as I knew eventually, you know, would need to happen, to kind of speak to some of my perspective on the methodology and the assumptions of evolutionary psychology and of any discipline that makes claims about the hardwiring of traits and behaviors in our brains because of evolution. My view on that, just to kind of lay it out, and then, you know, we can discuss, debate, whatever we want to call it. But my view on that is that those claims, by and large, are profoundly unwarranted and underdetermined by the kind of evidence that we have. And it makes sense that such claims would be really tempting to make, because evolution is one of the strongest, most powerful, most well-established theories that, you know, science has ever furnished for us. And whenever we have a really compelling new scientific discovery, there's a whole bunch of offshoots, and many of them, you know, as has been argued by smarter scholars than me, pseudoscientific, or kind of trying to piggyback on what are impressive methods, you know, in the realm of, in this case, you know, the evolution of species and biology, and extend them into disciplines where there's a thirst for explanation and a thirst for, especially for sciencey sounding kind of evidence or conclusions that support existing intuitions. And I think a lot of what we hear in terms of the explanatory models that are provided, say, by evolutionary psychology for modern day human behavior, I think fit with existing intuitions that have been around for a long time, about differences between the genders, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, about the kinds of things that already kind of existed in our culture for, one reason or another, and that are now being furnished with this veneer of science. Again, this is obviously, I'm taking a kind of hardline view about the motivations and kind of the discipline of the field, that we're in a massive way putting the cart before the horse, that these are phenomena that in fact we still don't understand that well in a lot of cases, where we're trying to explain an explanandum that we're not always clear on. Like, we don't even know that it's the case, or when it's the case and for whom, that today in the present, that women are motivated to pursue these versus those kinds of men. And we know that there are statistical patterns, but there are some things we know and a lot of things we don't about, like, how does changing your thinking actually affect the extent to which you still have the same preference, or to what extent does your preference relate to your level of impulsivity or other personality traits, as they show up in other domains of your life. That there's so much to still be learned about psychological phenomena as they exist today, that trying to impute evolutionary explanations for those phenomena is in effect a kind of arbitrary exercise, in reversing the kind of the what and the why.
So I think it's fair to give Dr. Fleischman
yes, me too.
the space to a brief reply on this. And the reason I say brief is because I want to go to the audience after that. So anyone having a question, you can raise your hands or put on the chat. Diana.
Okay. Gina's view about evolutionary psychology is not at all unpopular. It's quite a popular view that evolutionary psychology is just simply trying to impute causes and put a veneer, so sort of scientism, on various different phenomena. Evolutionary psychologists essentially think there's this concept that E.O. Wilson, who's a biologist, came up with, which is called Consilience. And the idea is that different fields of science should actually be in agreement with one another. It's also a similar kind of word to parsimony. And so if we establish that certain non-human animals do things for reasons that have to do with survival and reproduction, then you can say potentially that humans can get past that because they have these larger brains, but I don't think that you can say that humans can get past that entirely. And in the same way that our bodies have adaptations for various different purposes that are evolutionarily and adaptively relevant, we think that the human mind has those things. Now, I don't think that's arbitrary at all, because if that's how we explain all other animal behavior, it seems to me that it would make sense to also ascribe these explanations to human behavior. But it is unpopular because it seems to be an affront to and undermine human dignity. And I think that's a similar kind of reason why people don't like determinism, is it seems to have and be an affront to and undermine human dignity. In reality, people want to be not able to be predicted by simple things. People don't want to be able to be predicted by their sex or their age or their genes, because people, and I think there's good evolutionary reasons why people would like to be unpredictable to others, because they don't want to be controllable by others. And that is one reason, if I'm going to psychologize, why people are so interested in anti-evolutionary or cultural explanations and in free will, is because we ourselves are protean, that is, that we try and be changeable and unpredictable to others. And I think that there's good evolutionary reasons for that.
Thank you. So, my understanding...
I can't respond.
Sorry?
Yeah. Am I allowed to respond or no?
Yes, but
I've built up a whole list of things.
If you could keep it very short, I would appreciate it,
totally
so we
fair.
can go to the audience.
That's completely fair, and you can cut me off at any point.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess just on the point of consilience and the idea that if non-human animals are subject to evolutionary pressures, and that, where we have a lot of ability already to explain many features of non-human animals by way of adaptive evolution, that we should be able to do the same with humans. There's a level of analysis at which I completely agree with that. I think absolutely we've evolved like all the other animals evolved. Where I think there's a lot of unwarranted and premature inference that happens is at the level where we purport to know, first of all, like what are the units that evolve? What are the kind of the explananda? And you had mentioned the idea of modularity before, Diana, the idea that our mind is partitioned in these various ways. I know, again, experts in philosophy of science and biology have argued much better than I will here about kind of the extent to which, first of all, we would need a mass of evidence to, that kind of, again, the burden of proof is on anybody kind of asserting the, speaking of parsimony, kind of this division into various specific kind of functions within our mind, whereas there's no reason that we have, and Shirley today, to discount the idea that our mind evolved, you know, as a kind of more global and integrated mechanism for reasoning and for decision making, for kind of learning and automatizing habits, etc. So I don't want to ramble too much. There's a lot more I could say, but there's some kind of fundamental disagreement there.
Thank you. And keep in mind that you will be able to address some of the points that you didn't have to address, may be triggered by one of the questions. So my message to the audience is that the topic that we discuss, the way I understand it, is a very hot topic within psychology, and yet it was discussed with civility and a good spirit. So I would encourage the questions also to be in good spirit.
Thank you.
So let's start with I'll start with the live questions. We have many questions in the chat, but I'll prioritize live questions. Lee, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. Okay, that's very interesting. I'm going to take this opportunity, because it's just thrust upon me, to plug my paper with Monroe Trout entitled "What is Consciousness For?" that you can get. What is consciousness for? That you can get for free on the website of New Ideas in Psychology. If you just put in "What is consciousness for?" My name is Lee Pearson, Pierson, and this is apropos because the title of the session here is Evolution and Volition, and I have seen nothing combining those two things, and I'm not surprised, because on the one hand, evolutionary psychology, which I have more sympathy for than Gina, a little more, has an area that is where it's an utter failure, an undeniable utter failure, and that is in explaining consciousness. And consciousness is really important. But because evolutionary psychology grew up, Kosmides and Tooby were hardline information processing psychologists. There's no room in consciousness in their theories, and that is continued. It doesn't have to continue that way. But my view, if you read the paper, you will see is that you cannot understand consciousness without bringing in volition, and in particular without bringing in libertarian free will. This compatibilism stuff is no good. Is a complete, as James put it, it's a quagmire of evasion. You got to have actual free will, and we described how that would have adaptive value for organisms, and that and then by the way, there are Daniel Kahneman is not the only Nobel Prize winner in psychology. There were three. One was the guy from Carnegie Mellon. The guy from Carnegie Mellon. Who was that?
We'll all Google it. Somebody anyway, Google it and put it in the chat.
But the one I wanted to mention is Roger Sperry, the neuropsychologist from Caltech, who was an advocate of some kind of free will and was the one who did those split brain studies or the original split brain studies that Dr. Fleischman referred to. And he's actually the best of the three by far, in my opinion. Anyway, just one more thing about why it has to be libertarian free will, because this is really important. Because you might think you can, because of the compatibilism is this disease, it makes people think, well, an organism that's determined can do the same kind of deliberation, the same kind of metacognition. I hate that word. It's a nasty evasion for introspection, because metacognition doesn't have to be conscious. I'd throw that word out. But anyway, the fact is, or I would argue, and I can't give the argument, that you need free will to be objective, to have any kind of objective knowledge. And I'll just give you just the briefest case. There's a book, current good book by Locke, Lockie, called Free Will and Epistemology. And that is the cutting edge version of this argument that free will is an absolute necessity for being objective in science or anywhere else. And I'll just give you my version of the argument that I can give in 5 seconds, because I know Nikos wants to move on here. You mentioned that artificial intelligence programs can fix their own code. They are highly limited in this. And a deterministic program can modify itself in accordance with its program. It can do that kind of modification, but it can't override itself. It cannot override its programming. And therefore, its ability to modify itself, to self-correct, is severely limited. Human beings have volition, free will, and that's what gives us the possibility of overriding the bad programming that we have. And it makes a big difference. Now, there's a lot more to that argument, and I do recommend the Locke book. If it's a little different, it's kind of a technical philosophy book, but it's worth reading, because that's the cutting edge argument, and that's the argument that determinists, it's back. I think the ball is back in their court now. They have to overcome that argument. But evolutionary psychology could be a fine thing if they didn't assume determinism, and the information processing model of psychology, which is the computer model, which is a bad model for human beings. If that's kind of a historical thing, there's no reason why that has to remain in effect. And somebody in the field could do something about that if she wanted to. I could go on, but I'd better stop now, because no doubt Nikos wants to.
No,
Is there a question
Lee, I will put Locke's book on the chat. Lockie. Lockie. Oh yeah, I know him, but can I encourage you to put your article in the chat, the link?
Okay, well, I could put, yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll at least put where you can find it.
Yes, put your article, yeah. And I would put
Herbert Simon was the other Nobel Prize winner, psychology. Right. He was a notorious determinist, hardline determinist. Roger Sperry is much better, and he was the one, in my opinion, well, Kahneman is interesting. All right.
Is there a question here, Lee?
I better stop.
I'll just say,
thank you.
I'll just say that that I appreciate that you are that you think that compatibilism is a quagmire of misunderstanding, because I think that compatibilism is contingent on just redefining things. I think it's Sam Harris, who says something interesting about compatibilism, is that if you redefine God as being like the universe, or if you redefine the sun, instead of saying sun, you say moon, and you're like, oh, you have to put on sunblock, or if you put on moon block, or you have to put your hands, your plants out in the moonlight, then people don't really know what you mean anymore. So I do think that these wishy-washy definitions are a major thing. I would just ask Gina, are you a compatibilist, Gina, or are you a libertarian free willer?
No, I'm a libertarian free willer. And so, I mean, the nice thing is we can agree on something, which is that compatibilism is a wishy-washy mishmash of terms that's trying to kind of get away with its own fuzziness. So we happen to fall on opposite lines of the debate. But,
I would say that, just like, Skinner, and I put that reading in there, just like Skinner says, if objects could decide whether or not they were going to fall or not, there would be no science of physics. If there was some external unpredictable characteristic that caused objects to move or not, then there would be no science of physics. And I would similarly say that if I was to adopt a libertarian free will position, I would just not bother learning science or doing science anymore, because there is no science of human behavior without determinism.
So can I respond to that? So I think it's actually really interesting, the error of imputing intention, volition to physical objects, and the way that interfered with the science of physics. I think it's actually the exact same error being now made in reverse. I think the error of taking what's most familiar to us, which is consciousness, which is our own, how our own behaviors are caused, which is, at least in part, we notice that there are things we want, and then we act on those things, and we have these, fears and values and desires. and we falsely inferred from ourselves to physical objects, and that was a major error and caused a lot of trouble. And I think what's happening now is we're doing the exact same thing in reverse. We're trying to infer from physical objects onto ourselves and onto our consciousness. And I think it's going to interfere in the same way with a true science of human behavior.
What would you say about consciousness? I only have very little things to say about it, but I don't know. What would you say about consciousness?
About it as an entity or as a...
What do you think about consciousness? Do you think, I mean, so what Lee was saying was that evolutionary psychology doesn't adequately explain consciousness. My personal view is that there's nothing to explain. Like I think that any superordinate mechanism.
We'll keep you muted for this one, Lee.
My view is that if you have a superordinate mechanism that can oversee, many aspects of the rest of your mind, or if you have a superordinate mechanism that reports on what's going on in the rest of your mind to others, like a kind of press secretary mechanism that some people have talked about, then that would be indistinguishable from consciousness. And I do think that if you had an artificial intelligence that was capable of, I think that that's a certain kind of consciousness, is being able to report on the totality of the computation that's going on in the machine. But that's, that's just my view. Like, it's a very, very unpopular view, but it's in keeping with all my other unpopular views.
So I guess a couple things. It's funny, Nikos was saying at the beginning that we are both kind of contrarian relative to the academy, but just in different ways. And I guess for me, it's so interesting to hear you say that your view is the unpopular one, because my experience is that it's very much the accepted and going view, that there's a kind of reductionist bias within every kind of scientific and most of the social science fields that I've kind of interacted with. And I've had to kind of do a lot of work to even insert the hypothesis that maybe consciousness is, different in certain ways that don't make it weird and mysterious and non-causal, from from matter and from physical stuff. I've always been on the kind of radical end of whatever discussion I've had with kind of my fellow academics when I introduced that idea, because I think right now scientism, kind of a reductionistic view of us, the universe and everything, is the received wisdom. And as far as, where do I get off thinking that we have consciousness? I would say, because of all the evidence I have, starting with observations again of myself and of my patients and of everybody that I interact with, of all the different things consciousness does, and how I see myself as being different from a robot, how I see myself as someone who's behaving like a robot, and ways that that's different from other times when I'm self-aware and actually, kind of bring my own reasoning to bear. And I think, again, the burden of proof is on anybody who denies all that evidence on some deductive kind of theoretical ground that infers something about the nature of conscious beings from the nature of non-conscious beings.
Interesting what you mentioned, Gina, and in a way you are both outsiders in allowable opinion, because there's this very weird combination of the determinism of I couldn't help it kind of category, or I was born this way in the culture, which basically means that change is basically futile. But at the same time, if I dare, when I teach gender or whatever in social science, if I dare bring evolutionary psychology, I'm already into trouble. It's like, oh, Jordan Peterson, pop psychology, whatever. So it's interesting how these views in a way are different to each other, but also I would agree that they're different to the mainstream. Now, I've been told that this is not necessarily the case in the field of psychology, but in social sciences, it's definitely that evolutionary psychology is almost as unpopular as a human agency and free will centered view. Now, let's go to some questions. There are many comments, so the only way for you to be sure that your question is going to be asked is to raise your hand. I will start with questions that I can understand. With technical questions, please just raise your hand, because I'm not that clever. So, what is the implication of no free will on legal aspects? If I am not responsible for a crime, then is it fair to punish me? I guess the question goes to Diana. But we'll get Gina.
I'm going to allude to a strangely celebrated film called The Purge, or I could just allude to what's happening in American cities right now. is that when you have very little policing and people think that they're not going to be punished for their crimes, they tend to commit more crimes. Now, does that mean that everyone is a murderer if they feel like they would not be punished? I mean, I think there's probably some people who would not murder anybody, even if somebody raped their daughter right in front of them and they were on a deserted island. But there are most people who would do that if there was no likelihood of being of retribution. And so I think that punishment is important because it can be preventative and because it does deter some forms of crime. But I think that one major problem with the free will view is the free will view actually precludes us thinking about various different ways that we might be able to change human behavior other than through punishment and social disapproval. A very famous film that people watch is something called A Clockwork Orange. And in A Clockwork Orange, we feel, at least I do, even though I don't want to, sympathy for basically like a sociopathic rapist and murderer, because a bunch of possible choices that he could do, like killing or beating up people, are precluded by his conditioning. So they do behaviorist conditioning on him such that he can't, rape and murder people without feeling nauseous. So he becomes kind of declawed in that way. And what I think is that, even if you ask people, there's a famous website which is called Virtuous Pedophile, VirtPed, where people exchange tips on how they can go to a therapist and get on birth control, which is the closest thing that they can get to chemical castration, because people will not chemically castrate them, even if they want to be chemically castrated, because they have a pedophilic orientation, regardless of where you think that came from, whether you think they chose to have one, or whether you think for some reason they would choose to have one, or whether you think that there was some deterministic reason for them to have one. They have decided that they don't want to act on that. So in that case, there are people who would like to change their behavior in that way. But all that people want to do when they hear about somebody having a pedophilic orientation is to kill that person or beat them up. And it's true that we know very little about how to change people's behavior. We know for sure that prison doesn't seem to help rehabilitate people or change their behavior long term, with the exception of potentially sometimes people find religion in prison, and that religion puts a punishment and reward matrix over their life where they can consider what God would think of what they're doing, and then that changes their behavior long term. Generally, prison doesn't rehabilitate people, but what it does do is it keeps people who cannot behave in a way that is socially acceptable to us from causing harm.
But is there moral culpability? Is it moral culpability to someone who is doing bad stuff? Or could we say, well, if free will is the way most people understand is an illusion, then why would there be moral culpability?
The feeling that we have that somebody is morally culpable is a vehicle to punish them. There is really no point in feeling that somebody is morally culpable. The feeling that somebody did something wrong is a vehicle with which to punish them, and that punishment precludes future behavior. You can stop feeling that people are morally culpable, if you want to, or you could still feel that they're morally culpable. It's the punishment that matters, right? And so I think
you also judge yourself, though, right? So for me, morality, and for me also for objectivism, morality is first and foremost a way for you to go through life, to decide what is right and wrong. So even in a desert island, you would need morality. For example, you wouldn't stay under the tree being lazy, because then you're gonna die. So even when you were you with yourself, aren't you still morally culpable? So aren't you still to be judged for your decision by the ultimate judge, which is yourself and reality? In terms of, you do good things happen. You do bad things happen to you.
We all act as if free will exists, and that, yes, if you do good things happen to you, and if you do bad things happen to you, because that is the best way of putting a behaviorist reward and punishment structure over all our behavior. And if I feel like I've been bad or I'm morally culpable for doing something, and then I feel guilt, it makes me less likely to do those things in the future. I also behave intrinsically like I have free will, because it's the best way for me to change my behavior, but I don't believe it on a philosophical level.
That's a very interesting point.
That must be a really difficult thing.
Yeah, I think we'll need Gina's help here, because I think this touches at the core of your argument. Gina.
Okay, so I have a built up reserve of things, but maybe I'll kind of start from the end. So one question I would ask, Dana, is of the ways that you've mentioned that we need rewards and punishments, and that we are determined to seek out certain kinds of or even be deluded about our own moral agency in order to then behave better. Are you determined to think that? And if so, how on earth do you know that you're right? I mean, are you sure you haven't just misinterpreted all the data based on your evolved proclivities to either believe that you're a good scientist or to seek dominance over other people by providing them with explanations for their behavior? Now, I don't actually think those things are true of you. You strike me as someone who is really trying to get things right and really cares about, truth and nuance. But how on earth can you be sure that you haven't just been determined to believe these things? And if so,
all organisms are determined, and all physical things are determined. It just doesn't make
how do you know
something outside, like in your paper, the argument you make is kind of a free will of the gaps kind of argument, which is that because we can't explain 46% of the variation in this particular characteristic, then that leaves some potential space for free will. When we can explain those things, when we are able to potentially in the future look at somebody's history, look at their brain, look at their genetics, and predict people with much better accuracy, then does that mean, for me, we are already there, right? We just, the only thing that's missing is our inability to actually predict human behavior. And our inability to predict human behavior is to a great extent caused by people who will not believe in determinism.
Okay, so a few things. So first of all, I don't think I'm going outside of anything in order to explain human behavior. I think I'm actually, if anything, going inside and noticing a lot of the different ways that my behavior gets caused, like that I, feel like doing something and I either act on it or I think a little bit more about, well, what are going to be the consequences? And sometimes I lack knowledge and I act impetuously, and other times, I remember something I learned the other day and that helps me to bring that to bear. So I don't think I'm going anywhere outside of my observational field. And I actually think, in fact, I agree with you, there's a lot that we know about how to predict human behavior. We know it by studying consciousness and by studying human motivations and by studying cognitive models of psychology that provide us with explanations for things like, for example, suicide, which is one case where I don't think evolutionary psychology even claims to have a really compelling explanation for suicide. In the meantime, we have all kinds of explanatory models that have been backed by a lot of evidence about hopelessness and about the kind of ideations that, and what kind of gets you from an ideation to an intention to a plan, and whether you believe that there's a particular kind of future open to you. And we have interventions based on our understanding of why people sometimes come to believe that that there's no future for them, and why people develop a capability for self-harm. We didn't get any of that by studying or by trying to guess what it was about our ancestors from 1 million years ago that made it such that today we sometimes want to kill ourselves. So I think you're right. We have tons of explanations, but they come from the study of humans as they are now and of the actual phenomenon, including a lot of conscious phenomena, not from trying to impute remote causes.
So let me go back to the audience.
Just one thing that I think is very.
I want to hear Diana. Yeah.
Okay, so there's one thing I think is really important, is that there's a difference between approximate and an ultimate level of explanation, right? You can say, why are men taller than women? Men are taller than women because their bones are longer, or men are taller than women because there's been an evolutionary history such that men were often in physical combat with each other, and such tallness was selected, right? So those are two things. And I also think that you can think about approximate and ultimate explanation for why you believe in free will or not. You can believe in free will because you feel it inside of yourself, right? Your conscious experience leads you to believe that, or you can have a belief that's more informed by what might call an outside view. And so I think that evolutionary psychology, in terms of an adaptive explanation for suicide, I think that you're caricaturing evolutionary psychology a lot in this instance, because what you're saying is that there's some kind of evolutionary reason why we might commit suicide. Suicide is actually not that common in many places in the world and among hunter-gatherers. And also there's this thing called mismatch, which is about how the modern environment and our ancestral psychology combine in ways that can make novel phenomenon that we can't explain very easily, in the same way that we can't explain, for example, I'll just throw in something spicy, koalas in captivity, they pile on and they have huge lesbian orgies. They have sex sometimes only with other females, and they don't know what it is about being in captivity that makes koalas lesbians, but it's some kind of mismatch, right? I can't evolutionarily explain that about koalas, even though koalas, I think, are simpler than human beings.
Sure. So we agree that there are some phenomena that at least are hard to explain through an adaptationist hypothesis, and
I would totally agree with that,
and presumably we also agree that not every trait evolved because it was adaptive, that there are things like byproducts of other adaptive traits, that there are things like, that there's noise, and that there are mechanisms of evolutionary development that are not adaptive. So then the question becomes, well, which things do we think are adaptive and why do we think that? Right? And we have different answers to that question, obviously.
Okay, let's see what other questions our audience has. So it's impossible to address all of them in the chat. So again, if you're very eager to ask it, you need to raise your hand. So another question from the chat, which is clear enough so I can understand and ask. What are the implications of evolutionary psychology for mental illness and treatment, and for moral agency and self-improvement? So what are the implications of evolutionary psychology for mental illness and treatment, and for moral agency and self-improvement? So Diana and then Gina.
That is a big effing question.
Yes, indeed.
So there are people who do try and do therapeutic approaches from a sort of an evolutionary perspective. What I would say is, I've read so many clinicians who posit certain things about human behavior that are just completely not in keeping at all with anything that we know about any other organisms or any other animals. So I do think that there's a lot of wishful thinking that happens in therapy about how much people can change and how. But I do think that in evolutionary perspective, for example, many people have talked about treating mental illness by aligning our current environment more with things that would have indicated a good and propitious environment in the past. So one thing that happens that's very unusual in the modern environment, and this is all part of kind of mismatch, is that we're indoors a lot, that we live away from our extended families. And this is the kind of thing that Gina would say, well, this is just simple intuition, that we would think that being around family and friends is important. But an evolutionary perspective also says that there are certain things that that reduce our quality of life because they are so different from the environment in which we evolved. Just like we wouldn't keep animals in an environment very different from the environment in which they evolved in, without expecting that there would be serious ramifications in terms of mental health. In terms of self-improvement, for me, in terms of self-improvement, I often am more honest with myself, I think, about what my motivations are, because I don't have this sense of human dignity and of having lofty motivations that I think other people do. Oftentimes I'll think, I'm jealous. I want to monopolize this person's attention and or resources. I want to dominate this other person. And actually understanding why, like the most cynical possible interpretation of what I'm doing from an evolutionary perspective, I think makes me better at considering that that's not the kind of person that I want to be. So I think there's, Buddhists talk about this in terms of like the monkey mind, right? That there's an aspect of us that is very primitive and has incredibly primitive motivations. And I think an evolutionary perspective leads us to be able to understand that, and thus better be able to figure out how to work around it, how to figure out incentives to lead us to be better versions of ourselves. But ultimately, this is part of the major reason that I'm a transhumanist, is that I do think that humans cannot become better through talk therapy or therapeutic approaches, or even through drugs. I do think that we're going to have to either become more technologically advanced, such that we meld with technology, or we genetically alter ourselves to become much better than our evolved form that we see right now.
Gina.
Respond. Okay, so this is where, I really need to take issue, because what you're saying is up against a lot of science to the contrary. We have a bunch of psychological interventions that work. And again, there are now probably thousands of randomized clinical trials and various kinds of, experimental designs that look within the clinic, within the lab, that cut across every kind of pathology imaginable, including, people who are criminal offenders, people with personality disorders. I agree with you, by the way, that putting people in jail, that punishment, and deterrence through kind of punishment-based conditioning is not the best intervention if you want lasting behavior change. The good news is our interventions don't rely very heavily on punishment because we have so many more effective ways of actually helping people make lasting changes in their life, in every aspect of their behavior, from whether they smoke and drink to whether they fundamentally kind of feel insecure in themselves in a way that leads them to be dicks to other people, and whether they pursue, I'm glad you gave the example of the virtuous pedophiles who actually, even though in fact this is one of the hardest to treat, this is kind of at the fringes of what we currently know how to change through psychological, therapeutic interventions, still we've got, people who are going kind of out of their way to find interventions to help them not commit, not engage in the behavior that they are so tempted to engage in, because they themselves have reflected and have seen it as wrong, as abhorrent, and they're actually acting upon themselves, even in that kind of worst case scenario. But in the majority of cases, my whole field over the past several decades has amassed such a vast literature of empirical data, of evidence to suggest, not just to suggest, but to, it's been really well replicated. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been replicated and extended across, every pathology under the sun, including now psychosis and, some of the kinds of disorders that we used to think were completely untreatable, like borderline personality disorder. And people make lasting changes in their character that at 1 year, 2 year, 5 year follow-up, in many cases, that they've been able to maintain. And I know it firsthand because I've worked with some of those people and I've applied some of those therapeutic strategies. So, I just want to really put in
I absolutely agree with you that there are clinical interventions that work. I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I do think that, these are, I also think that somebody has to want to change.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the volitional aspects of therapeutic change that we can't reduce away or explain away, whatever our pre-existing philosophical commitments about the nature of causality, because observably people resist and people fight back and people rationalize away their behavior until and unless they are kind of willing to make the choice, which is not a random, accidental, non-causal thing, by the way. There are real ways that we can actually incentivize them to want to make a change or to look at the possibility of change by presenting them with evidence that it's possible, with examples of other people who've done it, just with like a warm therapeutic environment where they don't feel as threatened, and so they're able to look at aspects of their experience that they were avoiding before. And they ultimately have to be the ones to choose to do it. So I completely agree with you on that point.
Okay. So we have a friend who's been trying to ask a question but hasn't been able to raise his hand. So I'll go to Spencer, and then I'll get to Greg, and then I'll get to Lee for more live questions. Spencer, I couldn't see your hand being raised, but hopefully now you are unmuted. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Great, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I have a few questions for Diana about some of the scientific questions, the specific science that's going on here, even though I think we live in a deterministic universe. So I think almost all the topics that have been covered are basically independent of the free will debate. My specific questions are regarding the one, and also Gina, maybe you have some thoughts on this, the idea that heritability and the mutability of a trait can be somewhat independent quantities, such that even though there's a high heritability for, say, schizophrenia, there's still interventions that you can place after the fact that will change that person's outcome, so that there's an environmental remedy for some genetics effects. In the behavioral genetics literature, I'm not sure that question has been fully answered, so I'm curious what ideas you have on that. And then my second specific question is about the role of consciousness. If it's truly immaterial, if it's just the experience itself, if that's how you understand the concept, can it not have, is it impossible for it to have a functional evolutionary basis? Because ultimately everything in evolution has to occur through the material universe to cause genes, a material thing, to move to the next generation. And then
can I just answer that real quick? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you,
just really, because for once I can do it quickly. So no, I don't think there's any reason to think it can't be caused in some way by, or emerge out of functional, evolution. I just don't think we know whether or how it does. Go ahead.
Diana. Diana.
Where did Diana go? Oh no, did we scare away Diana? No, she's made a tougher.
Okay, let's give her a second. Do you want, Gina? Do you want to address the first part of Spencer's question? Oh, here she is. Okay.
Sorry,
Okay.
I just did you know that there's a study that says that needing to pee makes you less likely to believe in free will? So I think that might have been what was going on that whole time.
That's amazing. Okay, well, glad we solved that.
No, there actually is a study that shows that, which is kind of funny.
Did you hear Spencer's question?
I did hear all of Spencer's
Okay,
question. I just did not hear Gina's response to his question. So yeah, I think that he was talking about schizophrenia and the behavioral genetics of schizophrenia, and also about conscious experience. I don't really know what he was asking me. I think I broadly agreed with him, but Spencer, would you mind taking another, just ask one more time what you asked me?
You're unmuted, Spencer.
Yeah, so the first specific scientific question that I wanted to get your thoughts on, and Gina's thoughts as well, was about the relationship between heritability and the mutability of a trait. So if there's a high heritability, yeah, and that's something that, in my experience as sort of a graduate student in training in this area, I don't think has really been answered to any degree in the literature. Basically, the problem being that if you have a high heritability for a trait, it may be the case that you can still impose an environmental intervention to switch around the biological systems, such that you actually end up changing the trait with maybe cognitive behavioral therapy, like Gina was talking about. So what's your take on that sort of broader question?
So people often confuse heritability and immutability. They think that if you're saying something is highly heritable, you're saying that it's innate. And there's a lot of very popular go-to examples for this, like what's it called? PKU. There are people who are allergic to basically a compound called PKU. And so if they can become severely cognitively disabled if they get it, but if they never get it, they won't. Similarly, you can have a very high potential likelihood of becoming an alcoholic. If you live somewhere where there is no alcohol, you'll never become an alcoholic. And Robert Plomin, who's a famous behavioral geneticist, has talked about the heritability of things like television watching, which people were surprised about because that seems like a totally environmental kind of thing. So I do think that if we had better genetic data, we actually would be able to, and we are getting towards that, we would have better ways to intervene on a case-by-case basis, on the basis of somebody's predisposition. So even now, I know some people who've done something like 23andMe or looked at other genetic markers, and they said, oh, I know that I have a predisposition to gain weight, or I have a predisposition to alcoholism, or I have a predisposition for certain health conditions. And so they inform themselves about how they're going to live their lives on the basis of those conditions. You know, if you know that you're very likely to be at risk for heart disease, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Greg. Sorry, Gina, do you want to comment?
Go ahead. I guess I basically agree with all that, but I just want to add that part of what that means, I agree with everything Dana just said. There's also research on the moderation of how heritable something is by certain environmental factors. So in nations that are less wealthy, that have poor nutrition, height is less heritable than in nations with better nutrition. Similarly, IQ, one of my favorite kind of mentors, Eric Turkheimer, who's also a famous behavior geneticist, found that the heritability of intelligence depends on your socioeconomic status and the kind of education you get, the kinds of neighborhood you live in, such that, Lee, are you saying that, are you guys having trouble hearing me, or is everything good? Okay, I just want to make sure that certain things are more or less heritable depending on whether you introduce certain environmental factors. And we can think about what that means for how we intervene on ourselves and how we make things mutable when we want them to be mutable, in similar ways to what Diana was saying.
Right, thank you. Greg, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, thank you.
Good. So Diana mentioned something earlier, just kind of, it seemed to go by in passing, and I wanted to ask her a little bit more about that and to get Gina's take on it. Diana, you said something about certain metacognitive abilities, seemingly maybe some of the ones that Gina was targeting or praising in interventions, only being available to people over a certain level in the IQ, with over a certain IQ. So could you say a little bit more about that and what you take to be the implications of that? And then I'd like to hear Gina's thoughts on if she's found, what works with people of different levels of intelligence, as far as she could estimate it.
Yeah, I think IQ is a major aspect that people don't really talk about directly in terms of something like cognitive volition, is that if you want to be able to change some aspect of yourself, there's two aspects of IQ that could be important for that. One of them is self-control, but self-control actually just might be another way of talking about problem solving. So I myself am very, very prone to become addicted to social media and to video games. Like I've probably spent 2 solid weeks on my floor playing Angry Birds on my phone, like in the past. And I have a serious problem with that. But I figured out ways to get myself, workarounds from that perspective, because I think, I have relatively high IQ and I'm able to have those workarounds. Similarly, I think there's some association between IQ and lifespan. So you can have, this Turkheimer result that Gina was talking about, actually, it's one of the only ones that shows lower heritability in lower SES groups. Other people haven't necessarily found that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we would see lower heritability for certain characteristics in higher IQ groups, because we would see those people coming up with ways to get around those potential characteristics that they might have. So somebody who is smart, who is prone to alcoholism, they'd probably be much more likely to do 23andMe, and they'd probably be much more likely to figure out ways to, as I talked about before, tie themselves to the mast than other people. And that's one reason why it's so important to have these kinds of social interventions, which make it possible to have workarounds for these inherent potential heritable characteristics that we all have that people can access. But previously I talked a little bit about punishment, and one reason why prison doesn't work very well is because it's so distal from the act. We know that punishment works very well if it happens right away. If you have a dog and he pees in the corner and you come home from work 4 hours later and you beat your dog has no idea why I did that. And that's basically what we're doing. I'm comparing people to dogs very liberally, but that's basically what we're doing. But more invasive aspects, like I know a guy who developed a thing called Pavlok, which is named after Pavlov, and it's actually a bracelet that you can have, that you can shock yourself. And what he did is that he had a weight problem, and he shocked himself every time he tasted sugar, such that the taste of sugar itself became aversive to him. And that's very effective, but many people would find that unpalatable, no pun intended, because that is the kind of thing that seems to undermine human dignity. But I think it's a much more effective way of changing behavior potentially.
Thank you. Gina.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, Greg, thank you for raising that, because that was one point I really wanted to come back to and address. So in my clinical experience, as well as based on a lot of research literature that I'm familiar with, it is very much not the case that metacognitive abilities are somehow the monopoly of smart people. So if anything, teaching and activating metacognitive skills that are already accessible by, for example, kids with ADHD and people who have learning disabilities, who have intellectual impairments, is in itself a really effective therapeutic technique. So, teaching them to do things like kind of break down a problem into steps, teaching them to do things like check with their own feelings, showing them a feelings chart and having them learn and practice kind of labeling their emotions, and then pausing, using mindfulness, using, kind of basic meditation practice to kind of pause and think about, okay, how do I want to respond, and what will be some pros and cons before they go ahead and react. These are interventions that rely on metacognitive capacity and that work with a wide range of people that in particular we often use in order to compensate for other deficits in people who are lower IQ, who are lower in kind of overall intellectual functioning. So I think it's, and then clinically, is where I really have kind of contrary experience, and where I know some of my clients would really take issue, because some of the people, I think Greg maybe asks in part because he's heard me talk about some of my most surprising cases as a therapist have been with people who, in one case, has a 4th grade education, worked as a farmer all his life. He had trauma from when he had served in Vietnam. He was now 70 years old. So kind of all the whole deck was kind of stacked against his being able to benefit from this elaborate cognitive processing therapy for PTSD. And he was one of my most successful patients who made dramatic changes in his life at 70 because he was super dedicated and he really wanted to fix things with his wife. And there were just like things that really motivated him, and he was diligent and he kept asking me questions and asking me to make things concrete, break things down. And he didn't have some of the hangups that smarter people might have about like, oh, but I should have figured this out by now, and what's wrong with me that I'm still struggling with it, the kind of ruminative, self-defeating processes that make it really hard for people to change and kind of sometimes make intelligence a liability to treatment. So I think the exact reverse is true. And if I can then also comment on, I think you were talking about Ilardi when you mentioned, that there have been interventions informed by evolutionary theory to try to, for example, address depression. And I want to say that intervention that involves like exercise and sunlight, or eating, more omega-3 and hanging out with friends, it's pretty heavily criticized within the field because of various aspects of the internal reality of depression that it really kind of trivializes or brushes over, including rumination and really deep beliefs about oneself and the world and what is possible that wouldn't necessarily appear in a clinical interview with a hunter-gatherer, who doesn't read and who hasn't been exposed to a lot of these like metacognitive questions about the self, but also is probably missing out on a lot of, the human experience.
So Andre is asking a question on morality. Before we get to his question, I have also a question which is related to morality, and we'll set the stage. So Diana, you talk a lot about you in your public appearances on the morality of effective altruism, which is the one that, if I understand well, you sign up to. And I know that Gina is a supporter, let's say, of the morality of rational egoism. And I would like to ask both of you, is there any link between your belief or not in free will or the nature of the universe, of determinism and all that stuff, and morality? So how do you link your morality to your, let's say, epistemology, to your belief or not of free will? And if you could give me a short answer, and then I'll get to Andre's question, which is a bit more specific on morality.
You want to go first? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gina. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Let's start with Gina on this.
All right, I'll try to give you the short version. The short version is, let's see how we do. They're very much linked for me in that I don't think that the way that other non-human animals kind of have built-in instincts and a built-in set of largely evolved adaptive mechanisms to ensure that they tend to do what helps them survive. I don't think that our cognitive apparatus, I think because of the ways that it allows tremendous flexibility and creativity in how we actually plan out our lives and, you know, and kind of work toward our own flourishing. I also don't think it comes with any guarantee. And so I think we need an ethical system in order to actually guide us on how to live our own best life. And just as, you know, that's the standard kind of automatically set for a dog or a cat, I think, you know, long story short, it's the standard that's appropriate to us as a, you know, a living being who's got a limited amount of time on this earth and wants to make the most of it.
Thank you. Diana.
I have an evolutionary view just generally. So my Twitter handle is Sentientist. So I think that non-human animals have the ability to suffer and to experience pain. And I think that they're morally important for that reason. I think that we should consider how we can hack ourselves, you know, morally, like how we can consider how to change our moral representation such that we care more about those that we wouldn't naturally care about. So there's this idea called expanding the circle, such that we tend to care most about our children and our family. And I'm not saying that people should not care about their children and their family, but I am saying that it, you know, you can leverage a philosophical perspective to try to care more about people outside of your immediate social circle. And that empathy tends to be very selective as to who we care about. And I don't think that evolution is a good guide to morality. It's a good guide to how to improve our morality, but I don't think about, you know, that how we feel naturally, the love we experience for our children or our husbands or our wives, or the disgust we feel at certain kinds of behavior or people is a good guide to what we should do about those things. And similarly, I don't think that my internal experience is necessarily a good epistemological way of figuring out the universe.
Thank you. So let's go then to Andres' question on morality, which is a bit more specific. What if different people operate on the general idea that we should all have morality, but on very differing concepts of what morality is? And therefore, different attitudes towards the same situations, but each one believing they are moral. So basically, different people, they disagree on morality, but they all think they're moral. But for example, for the one, it's moral to, let's say, throw you under the bus. For the other, it's not moral. So basically, what happens if we don't have a universal language of morality, which, to be honest, is the world we find ourselves today, specifically with relativism in morality? Who wants to tackle that?
You start. I think it's your turn to start.
Okay. I'm sorry, can I read this question somewhere? It seems like very involved. Maybe it's not.
It's somewhere on the chat. Actually, I'll try to. Okay, before I put it on the chat, Gina, do you want to start addressing it, and then I'll try to find it, because I put them all, I've put them all in a Word document, and then
I guess I can try to summarize and see if I get it right. So
yes.
Is the question to do with, so the phenomenon that I think the question is referencing is we have different moralities and we don't agree on what's good, so we act on different kind of moral commitments. Is the question then how to, you know, what are the consequences of that, or how to fix it, or do we think it's a problem? I could see that going in multiple directions. So I think I just need clarification on what about that.
So yeah.
Is it like, is there an objective morality or is there an absolute morality?
So here's how I see it. With Gina's, let's say, approach on morality, we can reach an objective morality, in which case we should reach a consensus, not a consensus, an understanding of what is moral and what not on objective grounds. The question is, and now I'm kind of changing Andres' question, but is it possible under Diana's system to come up with such an objective morality, and let's say universal morality? And if not, what is the alternative? And my view is that the alternative is what we see today, which is basically moral relativism and inability to communicate and agree on what is the good and what is not the good. Does it make sense now?
A little bit. Can I see if I can reframe the question, or Diana, you can answer based on your understanding, or I guess if I were to reframe it, in a way that I'm also wondering your take on it, Dana. It would be, given what you mentioned, that evolution doesn't really provide a good, or evolutionary psychology doesn't provide a good basis for morality, because our natural feelings of empathy and our natural inclinations and desires don't necessarily align with like what's morally good. What is a basis for morality? Like, why would you say that it's good to try to minimize suffering for sentient creatures, for example?
Yeah, so there is some kind of epistemological basis. So we all know, that suffering hurts, that suffering is bad, and that we all know what pleasure and what suffering feel like. And that includes other more evolved kinds of pleasures, like the pleasure of coming up with new ideas, or of awe, or of the feeling of companionable love. Those are all things that we know, and not all of them are necessarily things that other animals have in common to us. So I would say that there is, one aspect that I'm using as an aspect of epistemology, but also because I think it is fairly consistent with what we see in non-human animals. So I would say essentially that from an evolutionary perspective, I don't think an evolutionary psychology perspective that what we necessarily internally feel is necessarily a good guide to morality. But then I would say that culture would be even worse as a guide to morality, because it would be completely arbitrary from place to place. And that's actually not what we see. What we see is that there are certain values that people have in common from place to place. And maybe it's just because they're advantageous. Maybe that's not an evolutionary explanation, but there's a psychologist called Oliver Curry, or maybe he's an anthropologist, who talks about these kinds of human universals. And there are human moral universals around the world. And some of them are good, like, for example, that you should take care of your children and your parents. And some of them are bad, like that the out-group's lives matter less than the in-group's lives, right? And those are things that we can, I think, overcome, in my view, with utilitarianism, and I'm a utilitarian. So I would just kind of put that all out there. Although I do think this is somewhat further afield from our normal conversation.
Yeah. We went a bit away with psychology. So we only have, I don't want meetups to last that long, but the quality of this discussion, we had to go longer. So one more question, and that will be the last question. So many apologies to those who asked questions in the chat and I didn't address it. It was difficult to keep count of them. So Lee, and my introduction was also a message to kind of try to keep it short. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I want to, this has gone by, things are going by quickly here. I want to go back to heritability and unexplained variance, which I think is a completely wrong way to try to get at free will, because free will is not just another causal factor. It's a first cause, and you can't do it that way. To illustrate why, imagine a study, I don't think it's been done, maybe it has, of a behavioral genetic study of belief in evolutionary psychology. And I would bet money that they would find that belief in evolutionary psychology is heritable, because they always find everything's heritable. So it's going to be heritable. Now, imagine for a moment that it's 100% heritable. And just think about what the implication of that would be. That would mean that your belief in evolutionary psychology was basically an accident of genetics and has nothing to do with the truth of the statement. See, that is the essence of the contradiction of determinism right there. And it doesn't matter whether it's 100% genetic or 50% genetic and 50% environment or whatever. You're basically saying your beliefs are, if you hold the view that your beliefs are determined by antecedent factors of various kinds, your beliefs are accidental rather than in correspondence. You cannot make them in correspondence with the truth. Now, how does free will get past this? This is an important question, because I don't think any determinists understand this at all. How in the world? Because I think they think of free will as just another causal factor. And so what difference does it make? Well, what free will does in this situation is you have to look, instead of looking at the group, and heritability, of course, is within a range of environments, always calculated within a certain range. Rather than looking at that range of environments and a range of actions and a group, look at the individual. the individual who exerts free will is able to override the genetic and environmental factors 100%. And that must be true, or they cannot be objective. Otherwise, their beliefs are effectively accidental. Yeah.
Is there a question? Is there a question that you want to wrap us up with?
You like questions?
For us?
Well,
I do.
Doesn't that refute?
Lee, why don't I ask you a question? Lee,
determinism?
are you a panpsychist, Lee? Do you believe that all atoms in the universe have consciousness, or does consciousness start at a certain point in the evolutionary tree?
No, I think the answer to that, which is in the paper, what is consciousness for, is that consciousness is a radically emergent property from matter. So that the answer to that evolutionary question somebody brought up. So
the sun would be conscious? Because it's really big, right?
No. Evolution, Mother Nature, to use the metaphor, found consciousness, and it's adaptive for those organisms that possess it. Now, exactly how consciousness emerges from matter, as Gina has already pointed out, we don't know. We don't know that, but we know it did. It did emerge. Now, I actually don't 100% rule out panpsychism. I think it's kind of goofy. That's my main objection to it, is it's goofy. I think the more likely thing is emergentism, and it's a radical emergence. That is, a consciousness has causal powers that are not reducible to the causal powers of the matter. And then it evolved. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Consciousness is an evolutionary adaptation. And the adaptation is volition.
Nico?
Yes.
Is there somebody that hasn't asked a question who would like to ask a question, who has a question?
So
I second that.
Okay, well, I enjoy Lee's intervention, so no regret for giving him the last word.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I don't think there's any other question. So thank you so much for this. I think it's a matter of justice. So since Ayn Rand Center is doing so high quality events, the last word should be to the guy who's organizing these events. So Razi, will you say the goodbye words and thank our speakers and our audience?
Yeah, sure. So thanks to both our speakers. Gina was here last October, and we started talking about doing an event on this topic, and we were talking about doing an all-day event in London. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, or hasn't happened yet, but it might happen at some point. So thank you. And Diana, I'm really glad that we got, I think, a better, a person who articulates the evolutionary psychology position better than, the first names that come to mind when people think about evolutionary psychology. So this was a fantastic, and I know that, us sports fans know that away matches are always more difficult, and, coming to the Ayn Rand Center and, trying to defend determinism is not that easy. So,
Nico is very, very, very friendly to my position. I hope you don't cancel him for that.
Well, I think he'll
Kevin.
end up canceling me, but we'll see. We'll see what. And Nikos, thank you for putting up with my editorializing during the event.
No worries. That's the thing. When you chair, you put on your neutral mask. So I hope I did the good work. But yeah, many thanks to both speakers. They made my life quite easy. So many thanks.
Oh, and Nikos, you have a weekday live show on Facebook, right?
Yeah, the Ayn Rand Center UK has a daily show on Facebook, The Daily Objective, every day, 6 p.m. UK time, all sorts of possible topics. So basically, to be in tune with all that, make sure you follow the center on Twitter and on Facebook. I already told you how you can follow the work of our guests. You can follow their blog. I mean, I should have also put the links on.
If there's anything we haven't mentioned, Gina and Diana, now would be the time.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Just check out my blogs. I'm going to be blogging a lot more soon, and yeah, you can follow me at Sentientist on Twitter, and I post about everything I do, including stuff like this there. I also want to thank you guys for organizing this. I actually had a really good time. I was a little nervous about this because I'm not a free will expert, because I just never thought it was worth considering for very long. And
Thank you
actually,
for being
really
willing to
appreciate-
consider it.
I really appreciate Gina's expertise as well. I had a great time, but I love to argue. So here we are.
Good. So the
Very
blogs
much
of both our participants are on the text. Sorry, Gina, I didn't give you the last word.
Look, I pretty much have, I mean, very similar sentiments. I was really almost pleasantly surprised at how much fun this was. And I really appreciate, Dana, I agree that you've been able to articulate some of the arguments for evolutionary psychology better than other people I've had this argument with, which made for a much more, both pleasant, informative, and delightful argument. So thank you. And thank you for being willing to join us, on the not home court, whatever it's called, on the away.
Okay. So it looks like everyone is happy. We're all happy.
And we'll be even happier if you enjoyed this event and would support us in doing future events. You can do that on our website, which is due a relaunch very, very soon. But the membership page is there. It's ainrandcenter.co.uk/membership. And if you can't buy a membership, you can always share this event, share our other stuff, follow us on social media, and come to our next events, which are every Monday and every Wednesday.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.